I've taken a rather long, almost all uphill walk to the neighborhood of Abdali here in Amman, and I wanted to explore a brief but very dark chapter in Amman's modern history from the days of the terror wars. I'm here at the bar of the very posh landmark hotel in the Abdali neighborhood of Amman, and this was the former Radisson SAS that was suicide bombed by an Iraqi couple on the 9th of November in 2005, where they attacked a wedding party, killing 38 guests, including the bride and groom's, both bride and groom's fathers. I just wanted to come see this place for myself and the other two hotels that are nearby, just because I remember this story so vividly, and I was taking some time off the War on Terror beat back then, and I remember when this happened, I was, it was such a shocking thing, and I was just thinking about, some of the events of the War on Terror that were tied to Amman, such as the Cliff Hotel where I just visited, where the Japanese backpacker had begun his journey to Iraq. And this was at sort of the zenith of the Abu Musab al-Zarqawi period of the terror wars in 2004 and 2005. And sometimes there's that old expression, you want to put a face to a name, and sometimes I want to put a place to a story. So I just thought I would come here and just have a quick beverage and just sort of be in this place that I remember from that story that was so massive at the time, and I think it's kind of mostly forgotten here now. But the hotels are sort of fortress-like. I had to go through a metal detector. They have these up and down ramps to halt a potential suicide car bomb. And I saw somebody on Twitter the other day that was confused as to why the upscale hotels in this section of Amman have extra security. And this person seemed to not be aware of the tragedy that occurred here in 2005. Now I'm going to leave the former Radisson and head to the next location in the footsteps of this tragedy. The hotels that were attacked are in a very upscale part of Amman that is nothing like where I'm staying in the core of downtown. And it's interesting, actually, just sort of researching this old story. It's forcing me to get out of my little downtown comfort zone and check out another piece of Amman that kind of feels like Dubai about 20 years ago, aesthetically, kind of the vibe. Now I am crossing to the Grand Hyatt, whose name, unlike the Radisson turned landmark, the Grand Hyatt is still the same. Well, compared to the Radisson, where I could just walk in, the Grand Hyatt is like an absolute fortress. The whole hotel is surrounded by these giant walls. It was here where the second suicide bombing occurred on the night of 9 November 2005. And a suicide bomber didn't make it as far as the one at the former Radisson, but this time he detonated his explosives belt in the lobby here, which I assume is the justification for all of this, the security apparatus here. I think I read in an archived article in the Jordan Times that they call that day or that night Black Wednesday. So yeah, and this hotel is no joke. I mean, it almost looks like an embassy compound in the peak era of the Baghdad Green Zone, with lots of up and down ramp devices for to deter car bombs. There's a lot of security there. It's very polite, but even just while walking on the property, I'm just sort of had a little Starbucks cup with me. I'm just, you know, being a tourist. But I can still tell that the security men there were kind of, you know, looking to see if I belonged there, or kind of checking out my vibe. So just kind of acting like I was waiting for an Uber, and eventually walked off. I am now approaching the site of the third and final suicide bombing of that night, which was here at the Days Inn in Amman. This attack is talked about the least. It killed 3 Chinese nationals who were part of a visiting military delegation from China's National Defense University. And from the photos I could find on sort of internet 1.0 or 2.0 era, I'm not sure which, they were killed in what looked to be the parking lot here. And it looked like the attacker certainly didn't get very far, as in the case at the Radisson and the Grand Hyatt. So this was the least impactful and got the least media coverage. The targeting of the Days Inn almost seems a bit odd. I mean, yes, it's an American chain, but it's not remotely glamorous like the Radisson SAS or the Grand Hyatt. So it's a bit of an outlier. Maybe the attackers chose it because it was a soft target, because it was poorly defended. I don't know. I mean, it looks like a pretty reasonable, affordable place, unlike the other 2 locations. Now I am walking across Amman. I have walked nearly 8 kilometers to get to where I'm going today, and that is the Martyrs Park in the diplomatic quarter of Abdun, or it's adjacent to Abdun, actually, I think. And I'm looking to find the memorial for the 9 November 2005 suicide bombings here in Amman. I saw a snippet of this memorial on a BBC story on the 10-year anniversary back in 2015 via Google Images, and I showed it to a friend, and he said, I think I know where that is. That's in the Amman Martyrs Park. So there's a park already appropriate for such a memorial in terms of the name and the vibe. And now I am walking around the loop of the park. I can't seem to find an entrance for a human being without climbing a fence. I found a slight opening in a fence where there were a few security men kind of loitering. This place doesn't entirely feel like a public space, given that there's really nobody else here. There's a couple of children playing at a playground. Maybe it's just because it's in a posh neighborhood, who knows. Well, here it is. After much walking and much looking, this certainly isn't an advertised space, but this is the memorial for the 2005 suicide attacks. Here you can actually see there are 3 Chinese names of the 3 officials that were killed in the Days Inn, which was the 3rd and final bombing. Well, this is quite somber. Part of the reason why I wanted to seek this place out, and why I wanted to just look into the physical geography and history of this series of incidents, is because how much the terror wars shaped so much of the world, in terms of, like, I walked by the American embassy on the way here, and it's absurd, the amount of walls and security and police, and I'm an American and in decent standing with my country and my government, I like to think, and to me the facilities seemed so absolutely unapproachable. It was very, to say fortress-like is an understatement. And you know, it's amazing how these men, and in this case, one woman, with these crudely made suicide vests and belts and car bombs and all of these other things that were the key weapons in the terror wars, in what the terrorists would call martyrdom operations, which in English we would usually refer to as suicide bombings. How they reshaped not just societies in the West in terms of our airport security and wearing lanyards into office buildings, which everybody's still doing today, but they influenced places here in Jordan. It's just amazing how wide-ranging, and we think of that era as largely over, right? The United States pulled out of Afghanistan in an extremely shameful manner. The Americans have a tiny footprint relatively in Iraq, and a very small military footprint in Syria still ongoing. But we think of the terror wars as being mostly a thing of the past. But for the families of the victims, from 9/11 to the hotel bombings here in Amman, that era will never end. It lives with us. It lives with the people who suffered directly. Another thing that this monument kind of makes me think is that it very sadly represents the height of the Zarqawi era. Zarqawi, of course, was the terrorist whose nom de guerre was Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. And Zarqawi was meant to denote that he was from the northern city of Zarqa. And he was to be killed by the Americans 7-8 months later in June of 2006 in Iraq. But his operations managed to kill so many and destroy so many lives, and he was operating on a few different sort of tiers of Salafi jihadism, because one, he was one of the very initial proponents of takfirism, which was to say that other Muslims who were insufficiently Sunni, I should say, were apostates. And then, of course, al-Shia and Ismailis and other offshoots of Islam, like the Druze, were apostates. And he would go down in his own fiery hell in an American attack. We tend to think of the terror wars as occurring primarily within the confines of Afghanistan and Iraq, with offshoots of the drone wars in Pakistan and Yemen and Somalia and a few other places. And then we think of course, their effects at home in terms of veterans in the United States and the United Kingdom and other places where injured and dead soldiers returned. But they affected a hell of a lot of other places that you don't really think about. I mean, you think of Jordan and its capital Amman in particular as such an oasis of stability and such a turbulent neighborhood, to speak in cliches. But Jordan couldn't escape it, and this monument, it proves that. It touched so many lives in the worst possible ways. This was another unintended outcome of the Iraq War, because it powered monsters like Zarqawi, who was relatively obscure until he started his movement in Iraq, Jamaat al-Tawhid al-Jihad, the movement for monotheism and holy war. And then he started Al-Qaeda in Mesopotamia until his demise. One thing I noticed as soon as I approached the park was that the street the park was on was renamed Mustafa Akkad Street. You may not remember his name, but you probably know his legacy. Mustafa Akkad was a Syrian immigrant from Aleppo to the United States, who was famous for producing the Halloween horror film franchise that is much beloved by fans of American horror. And Mr. Akkad was killed in the suicide bombing at the Grand Hyatt. He and his daughter were in the lobby, and they were victims of the attack. and he was 78 years old, killed by a suicide bomber. And the monarchy here promptly renamed the street that the Martyrs Park lay on. I knew who Mr. Akkad was because he produced a film called The Message, which I had actually gotten on Netflix back in the days when you would get the DVDs in the mail from San Jose, California. And The Message was a film about the Prophet Muhammad that was meant to, this is part of the tragedy of Akkad being killed by a team of Zarqawi suicide attackers, because he had actually tried to bridge the gap between East and West by making this really touching film back in the 1970s. Weirdly, I found out though while researching it, because he couldn't get financing in Hollywood because of the bitterness towards the Palestinian cause and other issues that were going on at the time, he got financing from Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, which I never knew. That's an aspect of that story I definitely didn't know when I watched the film. Nonetheless, it's actually quite a beautiful film, and the man who tried to actually gently spread the word of the Prophet to a Western audience was the most famous person killed in the 2005 hotel bombings.